today's session. So, first of all, really big welcome back to everyone who's joining us again for our first session of 2025. It's really nice to see you all again. And definitely to anyone that's joining us for the first time, then welcome. We're really glad to meet you and hope that you'll be able to join us for some really engaging and engaging sessions for this year. So, just to sort of introduce the session really briefly, the kind of key topic for today is really about strengthening SoTL through theory, methodology, and reflexivity. And I'll hand over to our main presenter today in a moment. But first, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land on which I am currently working and learning from today, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. And I pay respect to elders past, present, and future, and really want to acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. And particularly, I think, as a scientist and educator, to acknowledge the really important role that Indigenous peoples have as the first scientists and educators of this land that we're on. So with that, I would also like to briefly introduce our presenter today and to then hand over to him. So we're joined today by Dr. Juan Fischer, who is an Education Research Fellow here with me at the University of Melbourne. And so he's going to give us a little bit of an introduction to some theories and methodologies that are really important in education research and SoTL, and hopefully have a sort of a nice introduction to the role that these play in SoTL today. So I will hand over to Juan.
Thank you, Mel. I also want to pay my respects to the indigenous people, the Boonwurrung people particularly, which is the country where I live and most of the time work, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And just let me first share and then which screen can you see? I guess the slides. Yes, right?
Yes, beautiful.
Excellent. Okay, so as Mel said, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we can strengthen SoTL and the importance of theory, obviously knowing a bit of methodology and reflexivity, what that has to do with SoTL. But first, I would like to know if you can put in the chat who is here today, what's your current role, maybe your background discipline, because not everyone comes from education, most people probably. And very briefly, what's your experience with SoTL? How long have you been doing SoTL? If you have done research or are focusing more on the scholarly teaching side of things? Okay, academic development, I can see that. Tricia, do you also do research?
Theoretically, yes.
Okay. Is it in academic development, in SoTL properly?
In SoTL, and then also a little bit of learning design, curriculum design, academic development space, like that
Okay.
third space area.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, not everyone is teaching directly in a classroom, and so the research will look very different. I can see background in higher education studies. Oh, excellent. Bit of research into teaching and learning, academic developer, biomedical science, interesting. Curtin University, academic development. Yeah, so there is variety here. I can see finance here, cell biology. So not everyone is coming from the same type of role. Not everyone will be doing the same type of research, but we are all in this sort of big space called SoTL, education designer. Okay. Yep. So as I expected, a very diverse group here. Um, so who am I? If I ask you, who are you? I'll tell you a bit of who I am. I did a bachelor in psychology a long time ago. The subject that I hated the most was educational psychology. I just couldn't stand it. And when I graduated, I started working as a research assistant focused on something called student life. And it was all over the place, but we were looking at the student experience at the university, mostly on the social side of things. And then we started working more on teaching and learning. And then I noticed that I was kind of not bad at it and I was interested in it. So I decided I want to do postgraduate education. And so I took a plane and left the land of coffee growers to the land of koalas and coffee drinkers. So I moved to Melbourne to do my master's in education. That was at Monash. And I was already focused on higher education. At some point, I started working as a research assistant at Monash, but in the School of Business and Economics. So I focused on work integrated learning, and I started doing my PhD in something different that was evaluative judgment in physics, which, as you can see, it's not my background. And I work at well, a little bit about that project. It was an ethnographic study on how students do things. So it was I've been at this point doing a lot of qualitative stuff, but also a lot of surveys, interviews. And then I also work at Deakin as a research assistant in also qualitative projects about student experience at different levels. As a learning developer, a little bit, as a teacher assistant in a graduate certificate in higher education. So I've been always working with different disciplines and at different levels of SoTL. And then I moved into UniMelb, which is where I work right now as an education research fellow. And I've been trying to do a bit of research, a bit of academic development, learning design. I've been trying to work on different aspects of that. So you can see I've worked with different disciplines, maybe different methodologies, but always focused on higher education. Where am I going to go next? We don't know yet, but this is where I am right now. So one of the things that I wanted to first kind of talk about and maybe move quickly is what's the relationship between SoTL and education research? Is that the same thing? Are they separate? And if someone wants to jump in and give their opinion, you're more than welcome, actually invited to do so. And then I can share my own opinion on this. I don't think there's any right or wrong. But okay, I'm gonna just jump. So the way I see these two things is, oh, I thought it was under gonna be one animation, is there is SoTL and there's education research, and there is an overlap on that. The part where I think it's mostly SoTL and not overlapping, maybe you could call it scholarly teaching. It's when I first read about SoTL, I heard about bringing scholarly habits into our teaching. So scholarly, doing research, collecting data, evaluating things, tweak again, accessing the literature, what knowledge do we already have, and make decisions evidence-based or evidence-based decisions. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're actually doing research, and that's okay. That it's still SoTL. The challenge is when, as part of our job, we have to do research, then I think that scholarly teaching might not be enough for the job we have. And then we start jumping into this intersection here. What I think is subtle research, I don't think it's any different than education research. It's just one part of education research. So if you're studying policy, if you're studying trends in enrollments of international students, or a very theoretical aspect of learning or identity, you're maybe not doing subtle research, but it doesn't mean that subtle is like the little brother. It's just a specific field like any other, and it focuses on teaching and learning. Then the thing is that I quite often see people trying to do an intervention in their own classroom and then evaluating, and that it's all fine and good, but I don't think that it's the only thing we can research about learning and about teaching. So there is a big world out there where we can do very interesting stuff, and it's only called subtle when we are in a subtle community, but it is as valid as any other education research out there. Leaving that topic aside, there's three things that I plan to address today. One is, why is theory important and what kind of theories are out there? And again, and this is not exhaustive. These are just some examples of some kind of theories that I know that I find useful, and I'm also focusing on learning, but there's many other useful theories there. Gonna talk a little bit about methodologies and methods, and about reflexivity and why it is important. But no one's gonna leave the room being an expert if you're not already an expert, because this is a big topic, big area. And what I want to do is kind of show you some of the language that it's there, give you some examples that then everyone can look on their own and in their own teams, because collaboration is very important here. So why is theory important? Does anyone want to jump ahead and share why is theory important, or how it can strengthen subtle? I saw some people were answering the question before in the chat. It helps us give us frameworks to work within. Yep. Frame the question and the methodology. Yes, there is a very important relationship between theory and methodology. Provides a lens. Yes. In a more connected way, that it's very important. Practices can vary in different contexts, but theory provides a channel for communication across different contexts. I think that's one of the most important things in this talk about theory, especially when we have a lot of small size qualitative studies. That's important, an important role for theory. Solid foundation, what we're doing, more robust, gives us a nice lens. Yeah. I think I could just go home and think there's already a room of experts here with amazing ideas. Some of those are I'm gonna be talking about them. So in one of those like famous books, especially in qualitative research, Creswell says that the research design process starts with the philosophical assumptions that the researchers have. He's talking about qualitative, but it's not just that. It's when we start thinking about what we want to do, we start from our own assumptions. Sometimes those assumptions are more explicit, and I think that it's when theory comes to place. It makes transparent what we are assuming learning is, how people learn, what's the role of teachers, and all of those things. So a definition of theory that kind of applies to every field is a reasonable, systematic, investigable, modifiable explanation of certain facts and phenomena. Yes, that it's a theory. In quantitative research, it tends to focus on the relationship between variables. It predicts independent or dependent variables. I do like the view of theory in the qualitative sense that, as people mentioned in the chat, it offers a way to look at the world, the assumptions people have, and it allows us to say what is important, how things work. And that is very important because when we talk about learning or teaching, everyone says learning, but we rarely think about, well, wait a minute. How is the process of learning work? How does it work? And why the decisions we're making are actually coming from a different theoretical perspective than what I'm trying to say right now. So that's very important. And as people also said in the chat, theory provides a means for allowing research accounts to build upon another instead of existing in isolation. So it's not just a bunch of random studies where I saw that this works here, but we never know if it works somewhere else. Theory can help to make a study bigger than just that specific context. So when we think about how the world works, maybe we can find an example of something in a specific context in one classroom, and we can't just simply transfer that it works here, so it's going to work there. But if we look at why that works, and that's when we need the theory. If this worked because we paid attention to the social aspects of the classroom interaction, because we really paid attention to the role of digital tools and accessibility, then we can make recommendations to other contexts. Maybe we can think about these are the things you should look into when you're doing your own study or when you're designing your intervention. But we can't just say, I did this, so therefore everyone should do it. So this is a very important part of the role of theory. And theory, what is it good for? I took that from Seinfeld. But following the work of Trowler, theory can have different purposes, specific uses, and it doesn't always have to be the same. The more traditional sense is in a hypothetical deductive approach where theory says this should happen, and we do it, and we test it, and we create hypotheses in a more maybe quantitative sense, but it can also be created in emancipatory. For example, think about theories of inclusion, critical theory. They help us to think about a different world, about a better world, and focus our teaching efforts, our research efforts in that direction. It also can help to be reimaginative and sensitizing, meaning we get the data like just a bunch of random stars, but it can help us to look at things in a different angle and reach new conclusions. And one of example I think when I was doing my own PhD was I read a paper that talked about how students are not playing the game when they decide not to do things and lose some marks for that. And when I was doing my research, I was focusing on what students do, why they do things they do. I took a properly student perspective, student-centered perspective, and realized that actually students are playing the game that was laid out for them. When someone says, I'm not going to do that because it only gives me 2 marks, but I'm going to spend 3 hours doing it, that it's okay. The problem is that we tend to assume that students should be doing what we want them to do because we know better. But when you assume a different theoretical lens, you can start realizing that those assumptions are not necessarily coherent with the world students lived in. And of course, as was mentioned in the chat before, theory also informs research design. How do we make decisions about methodology? And yes, it helps to explain the data. If students say they don't like lectures or something, you might start thinking, but why is that? What is the role that the lecturer is playing or not playing? Maybe we need to ask more questions. But yes, it starts unpacking the data we collect. In this part, I'm going to give some examples of types of theories and some of the theories that I know and some of them that I do like or not. In this part here, I don't have any specific reference to talk about it. There's some discussions in sociology about different levels of theories, and I'm extrapolating that into what I know in education, in teaching and learning. But the way I see it is that when we talk about theory, we can see it in a big spectrum of what I call foundational theories, and the word ontology comes there, and it's big and scary, but it's basically theories that tell us, yeah, it's rich. It took me a long time to understand what ontology meant, and now when I read it, I'm like, yeah, whatever. It's obviously I can't write a paper on ontology, but it talks about whatever object we're studying, what is that? What its reality, how it is constructed, how it relates to other things. So I think about these as how the world works. Theories, big theories of learning that you could apply to maybe any context, but it won't tell you exactly what to do or how things happen in that specific context. They offer you a lens. So I think these ones are more in the lens side of things. There are some others that maybe are middle ground, they're phenomenon specific. Is learning the big object? It's the phenomenon specific. I'm not very sure. That's not that important, but I think these are theories that have assumptions from the foundational theories, but now focus on something specific. And I'm going to give you some examples soon. And then there's other theories that I personally don't think are theories. They are frameworks that are useful. They can help us to design studies and interventions, but they are not necessarily how the world works, but how it should be. So yes, there is a bunch here, but to give you some examples, when we think about foundational theories, you can think about, for example, cognitivism. Cognitivism sees learning, or actually all human activity, as mental processes. So it focuses on attention, memory, and yeah, it focuses mostly on the individual side of things. Maybe related to that one, you can think about a middle ground theory and talk about cognitive load. That is a specific case. It's about attention. It's not about how the mind works. It's about attention. And it's very useful. It doesn't necessarily tell us you should do things this way, but you can see the principles. People will get overloaded, so make it simple. And I say that when I have a very busy slide, but don't focus on all of this. But there's other perspective. I think most people would talk here about social constructivism. I don't know how many of us have actually read deeply into social constructivism, but it starts talking more about what people do in order to learn, how they learn with others. But the way most people take social in this context is very different to the sociocultural theories, where the social is not just having others there. It's not just a group task. It's about we are actually always embedded into a social world with a history, with a language. Then the role of the language starts becoming more important. And while constructivists might say that the student construct the knowledge, in sociocultural theories, the knowledge is something more that it's social first, it's first shared in the world, and people become participants of that world. So it's not, they don't construct it themselves, they join an existing but also fluid world. So you can see that these things, and are quite a high level, and they don't tell you how to design a classroom, but you can start deriving some things from there. And then we have like in the middle ground, self-determination theory. That is a theory about motivation. It's more specific than just how people live in the world. And it has a set of concepts. If you have heard about intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation, orientation towards mastery, goals, all of that has to do with self-determination theory. And it's more applied than the previous ones. We have communities of practice, that it is a theoretical framework in its own. It's very related to practice theories, to social material theories. It's also very used as committees and groups, but that it's a different story. And then when we're talking about specific theories, guiding frameworks, I think, for example, self-regulated learning. There's many models of self-regulated learning, and they're very useful, but I think they talk less about how people learn and more about how we as educators can design activities or tasks to help students to become better learners, sorry. And the reason I say that is because they tend to have a very specific diagram cycle of how people do things, and if they do this, if they are self-regulated. But there are very effective learners that don't actually do that. So I struggle to see that as a theory of how learning works, and I see it more as a useful framework of how we can do interventions to support learners to learn better, more efficiently, more effectively, and maybe with less pain. And the same when we talk about assessment for learning, assessment literacy, we're talking about things that are very good, but they don't necessarily, on their own, they don't tell us what are our assumptions on how people learn. Are we designing assessment for learning from a social constructivist perspective, or are we more sociocultural? Are we doing things from a social material perspective? And we can still be talking about assessment for learning, assessment literacy, threshold concepts. Well, that's a bit more cognitive, I think. So a lot of information here, but I want you to just focus on there's different levels of theories that play different roles, and they're all very important. And then I wanted to go a little bit into this one, that is, there's metaphors of learning. This is specifically about learning. And Svard in 98, she talked about two types of metaphors, those about acquisition and those about participation. And then Elizabeth Wegner and Nucles have expanded that. They have said it's more about if learning or the knowledge that it's learned is seen as a thing, as an entity, or if it's more as a process. And what do I mean by this? That when we're talking about acquisition or transmission, we can think of learning from the cognitive perspective. There is information that gets passed and people get it. And maybe people struggle if they're cognitive loaded, but it is about passing information. It can be a little bit more complex than that, but it tends to become that. But then we can talk about construction. It's still a thing that students construct, but it is not just passed. Students have to be active in order to construct their knowledge, whatever that is. And it's not a matter of, oh, we should be doing this or it should be doing that. It's a matter of what learning actually is. Well, complex learning needs the learner to be active. But then we have other theories that move towards these other metaphors of learning. So for example, when we talk about communities of practice, it's not about anyone acquiring information in a community. in a group. It's more about people being part of that community, starting to work or do things as part of maybe peripheral in that community, as an apprentice, even as a lecturer. You start as an associate lecturer. You have some responsibilities you learn by doing, and that doing also includes talking and using resources and all sort of things. It doesn't neglect the more formal training, but it's more about becoming part of a community. The same with practice theories. They talk about knowledge it's not a thing that you just have and carry with you. It's more about learning how to go on in certain practices, how to behave and act and think like a biologist or like an accountant. You acquire, or you don't acquire, you develop your ability to use a specific language, to see the world in a particular way, to do certain skills. But it's not about you constructed independently of the world. You are part of that community, of that community of practice. And it's not about acquiring a piece of information. You can remember the information, but that's not what makes you be able to do things in the world. So what I wanted to show you here is that even when we talk about learning, there's very different ways to talk about learning. And sometimes these things just don't go well together. If you want to write a paper on practice theories and cognitivism, well, you can write about it, but mixing them, I think it's going to be very hard. And I did have this little note here about what do they mean by social? The social as the collective group, or the social as a community with a shared history, with a shared language. Those are very, very different ways of seeing social in the learning space. I want to stop here for a second, so then I can have a bit of a sip of my tea, but also ask you if you have any questions so far. Have you heard of these different levels of theories? Have you heard about metaphors of theories? Does this seem useful? I know it's a handful, but I want to hear your thoughts at the moment. I think we're good with time, right? Okay.
Yeah, about sort of 20 minutes before we'll probably start to wrap up the session today. Yeah.
Yeah. Some of these are familiar, some others aren't. Okay, Jenny, good to see you.
It's Alice here, Alice Brown.
Yes.
I'm also thinking you make it sound quite tidy and linear, and in reality, it's often quite messy and potentially even retrospective that we add theory, right? So
Yeah.
in the ideal world, it's all in good to front end the theory, but sometimes and even in completing a HEA fellowship or something like that, you kind of go, oh shit, what was the theory behind that? So I think you're talking in the ideal world, which is definitely the way, but I'm just wondering also whether there is potential at times, emergency times, for it to be retrospective.
Yes, I totally agree with you. Ideally, we have read a lot about theory and think, okay, well, this study is going to go in this way. In reality, yes, quite often we design a study, we already have collected data, and we have to figure out how to go back. And I think that's life. We are where we are right now. We can't go back. We sometimes retrofit. Yes, that happens. Ideally, we shouldn't do research like that, but that's something I really like about things like communities of practice as a theory of practice theories, social material. They would be very good to describe what you just said. People don't learn a thing, in this case a theory, and then go and apply it. That is how education works or tries to work. But in reality, we just live in this constant mess, in this flux of consciousness, and we're just crashing against the world, and we end up retrofitting stuff. The recommendation I would give is, if there is any of these theories that you have heard but you haven't read too much, maybe take the time to read one of them. You can't, like, I'm familiar with most of them because I studied them in my bachelor, then in my PhD, and I have read some of them. I angry read them because I was like, I really need to know about this, because I don't think it's what some people say it is, but it is a mess. The idea with this presentation is to give you like an overview of what's out there so you can start your own process. But I totally agree. We often have to figure out things as we go, but I think once you start becoming more familiar with a specific theory and you read more and you collaborate with other people, then when you start planning your future research or your next study, you already have those resources. You didn't have them 2 studies ago, but now you do. So you can maybe focus a little bit, and then there's still a little bit back and forth between, oh, we planned this for the study, but maybe it didn't quite work. I totally agree with that. So yes, this is an introduction. We should pay attention to this, but the reality is that we're already here and we have to figure out how to move forward. Having said that, I'm gonna move forward. I hope that answer or not answered your question, more like I hope it made sense. Yeah. So now talking about methodologies and methods, probably we already know there is a big kind of, I put that arrow there because it's a continuum, more or less sometimes. But yes, we have quantitative research, focuses more on measuring, testing, modeling variables, and it focuses on the validity, reliability, and accuracy of measurements. In a more qualitative sense, we focus on understanding, exploring. I added there generalizing analytically, which is what we talked about before in terms of using theory to say why or what this tells us about other things. And it moves more towards credibility and trustworthiness, because we know that in the qualitative realm, we can't just say that we measure reliably something, because we're not measuring. We're exploring people's perceptions, exploring their experience. The difference between methodology and methods, I would say think about methodology as a recipe. It's a plan, a strategy, the reasons why we put together methods. And those methods, think about it as the specific tools or cooking techniques. When you have a recipe, you think holistically. I want to make a stew. And then the methods would be, well, I have to cut the carrots, I have to boil, I have to do them in this order. But the methodology is what tells us what methods you could bring or you should bring and how they go well together. So methodology still kind of connects with theory a little bit, because practice theories are going to be a lot more qualitative than cognitive theories, which are going very well with measurements. And as examples of methodologies, when you think about, oh, I'm gonna study something about how my students learn, you can do quasi experiments, very, very common. You do an intervention, and I call it quasi because you can't actually isolate students, but you do an intervention and you measure pre and post. That's very common. There's survey studies. When people ask an open-ended question at the end, that's not necessarily mixed methods. That's still a survey. and it's fine. I wanted to mention ground theory here because it's not a theory. And a lot of people, when they read it, they're like, oh my God, I have to go and like, what's that theory? It's called ground theory because it's a methodology for building theories grounded on the data. And it tends to be in a qualitative sense that there is a process of how you code the data and how you create categories and clean it up. And it's often used when you want to build a theory and there is not a theory about that specific topic there. At the top of my head, I can think about a book that I read on fairness in assessment in higher education. There wasn't much research. They developed their own theory of what people think it's fairness and how we can design fair assessment. Case study. I also wanted to talk about it because sometimes people say, well, I'm working, I did an intervention in my class, so it's a case study. Well, not quite. Or I interviewed 2 students and that's 2 case studies. Well, not quite. Case study focuses a lot on what is your unit of analysis. So if you do an intervention and you measure pre and post 100 students, your unit of analysis is the student. And when you have 100, it's not a case study. The case study has to, you get maybe 1, 3, 4 students, but then you need to collect data in a deep manner. So if you, for example, do multiple interviews with the same student, you explore how they experience their pass through the whole degree. You're really focusing on those 3 cases, and each case it's specific. Or you can look at your subject as this is the case. So then you need to look at the context of the subject. Where does it fit in the program? Then you might have to look at how the subject has changed across different years and say, well, we tried this and it failed, but then we introduced this new thing and it started working. And then this subject, we got students going to an organization and working there. So it's more about the story of that subject as a case rather than, oh, well, I just did this in a small study, then it's a case study. That's different. I wanted to also mention autoethnography because there is a lot of publications in SoTL that are about the experience of the researcher themselves. I could be writing about what is my story, how I became the teacher I am right now, or how I became the researcher I am right now. And even though not everyone uses autoethnography, that methodology can be close to that type of publications, and they still count as publications. And the other one I wanted to touch on quickly is action research. Again, I tend to hear people saying, oh, well, I do an intervention, pre and post, that's action research. Some people might agree with that. But we could maybe separate it into practical action research that could describe, yes, the researcher does an intervention in their class, it's action, it's part of everyday life, it's part of their work, not just a research study, but that it's used for research purposes. We could call that as practical action research. You evaluate, improve, and continue in that cycle. But there's also a big body of work that has been developed in Latin America, but in Africa, but also in Australia, around participatory action research. They tend to do more work with communities. So then it's not about we come and do an intervention and measure it, but it's more about a consultation, a collaboration with the community, and they are participants and researchers, or they contribute to the research because through this maybe case, we develop knowledge together. In the case of education, even though some people might not call it participatory action research necessarily, we can think about students as partners. It's not just us coming and giving something to students saying, we think this benefits you, but it's more having those students helping us to construct that knowledge, to design those interventions. And they could be part of the research group or they could not necessarily write. But quite often I've seen papers that are published between academics and the students that were part of that group. So I wanted to show you this to say there is a big, like there is a wide range of methodologies that you could use depending on your interests, and also on your possibilities. Sometimes it's a lot easier to do a survey than a phenomenology study, but yeah. And I guess in terms of time, I'm also gonna go quickly on this, but just to show you there's many things we can do. There's measurements, so you can use assessment scores, surveys, attendance, time on task, participation. It depends on what you can measure and how you can measure those things. But there's also interviews or focus groups. In the past, I've used mapping. So it's a focus group where we got a bunch of students asking them things about the university and they drew a map of the university. Some parts didn't exist. Some parts were super big. One time they included the supermarket across the road because that was where they used to go and drink. And I say they, but I was very young at that time. There's photo eliciting, so there's many ways in which an interview can be more than a conversation. There's observations, participant and non-participant. Non-participant is when you just look at what they do. And you can also analyze documents and artifacts. Maybe it's the students' work. Maybe you can ask students to take photos of their study space, and then combine that with an interview. So there's many forms of collecting data besides interviews and surveys. And okay, just to go quickly too, again, there is many ways in which data can be analyzed. There's content analysis, which it's a more quantitative counting how many times certain words appear. There's thematic analysis and there's reflective thematic analysis. This is very common, and that's why I put here. If you're going to use thematic analysis, read Brown and Clark, but the newer stuff, not only the 2006 that everyone uses. Yeah, so there's many different ways in which a specific data set can be analyzed. This is focused more on the qualitative side of things. We don't have time to go through all of them, but I'm leaving the slide there for longer. So if anyone wants to go and check one of them, you can go and read it. I left the references there. So yeah, we don't have time to actually cover each one of them. I haven't gone into reflexivity, so maybe I'm gonna avoid these questions. Very quickly talk about reflexivity, and then when we have time to all have a chat. Reflexivity is often seen as the internal dialogue of the researcher, and their evaluation of what's their position in that field, in that study, but also includes explicitly recognizing it and understanding how it affects the process. So the position we have, if we are lecturers investigating students or other lecturers, our gender, our race, social class, many things can influence what we value in education, in research. They can influence the theories and methods. And as you can see now, everything is very kind of circular. Things influence each other. And very I wanted to highlight that sometimes it is expressed as there is a section where it says reflexivity, and people say who they are. So one of my first slides, who I am. But I think quite often our position also bleeds through the text, and the kind of conclusions you reach might tell you a bit about the assumptions you had when you say that students are not playing the game. It tells me that you see students as they don't know and we know better. And maybe some people think that it's okay, but it does tell you something about where these researchers stand in front of their participants and the knowledge they are constructing. And I also like this image because when in quantitative research, we want validity and reliability. In a lot of qualitative and educational research, we can't just say that we measure something reliably. So reflexivity is like this lens, or allows us to acknowledge that we have a lens that distorts the world that we see, but we are aware of that and we know how it's distorting it, and we try to acknowledge that, but also don't just simply react to our position, but be conscious of the methodological and the ethical decisions that we're making in our research. So yes, it's a very diverse field, and I know all of this sounds daunting for some people, for some others, maybe not so much. But what I would say from all of this is pick one thing, pick something that caught your attention, one theory that you have heard mentioned somewhere there. Go and read more on that specific one, but also collaborate. There's people who are already familiar with some theories. You can work with them, or in your groups, you can divide that task and help each other learn about a specific theory, about a specific methodology. Yeah, so pick one thing and collaborate. That would be my takeaway. I'm just also gonna just show this for anyone who in the recording wants to take the screenshot. This is only for the recording. And I'm gonna stop right there.
Thanks so much. It was really great to kind of get that nice overview and to start to think about how all these pieces connect. And it's also been nice following some of the comments in the chat that are coming through about that there's this range of options. There's so many options, which can be daunting, but at the same time, it's kind of powerful because you can just start somewhere that's sort of relevant to what you're doing at that particular point, start to explore, start to collaborate, and sort of it grows with you, I think, which is really, really a nice kind of positive way to end that session on. So thank you very much, Juan, for giving us so much to think about today.
Thank you for the invitation.
That's right.
I was hoping we had a little bit more time for discussing, but yeah.
That's all right. In this final couple of minutes, I'll throw maybe to Sue, and we'll give you a bit of an insight into next session.
Yeah, fantastic. Sorry, you made me have to find my unmute button. So next month we have Corinne Green presenting, and she's presenting a session called Reflecting on Reflective Practices as SoTL Scholars. So to give you a little bit of an overview of what Corinne will be presenting, Corinne will share her story of being and becoming a SoTL scholar, highlighting how she uses reflective practice to integrate intentional actions with taking up as yet unknown opportunities. Corinne will use her experiences in SoTL and in writing a book chapter about her experiences to invite you to engage in reflective practices, to clarify your intentions and be strategic in your SoTL choices. So I'm a little bit excited about this actually, because I am not as strategic as I could be in my SoTL choices. I think I take on a few too many opportunities, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Corinne talk about how she makes those strategic choices. Over to you, Mel.
Thanks very much. And I think in some ways that feels like this was a nice little intro today to get to start to think about some of that stuff. And hearing from Corinne in the next session really continues that discussion. So it will be really great to hear that, and we hope that you can join us all again next month. So thank you again for joining us today. Keep an eye out for some more communications about what we're kind of going to be looking at this year and some of the other sessions we have planned for you during this year, and keep that conversation going. And thank you very much, and hope you have a lovely weekend.
Thank you. Thank you, Mel.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you
Juan.
all.
Thank you.